Well, good morning, serious students of World War II. Mr. O'Brien here, staying in the Pacific. Today's episode is called Corralled in the Coral Sea, May of 1942. Gentlemen, interesting. I always like to start off a little artifact and trivial history. If you look at the flag on the left, the rising sun is called a hero moto. Sometimes you see the rising sun in a white field, and sometimes you see the rising sun with the rays. All right, during World War II, if you see the hero moto on a white field, that is the Japanese Army. If you see the insignia here with the rays of the sun, that is considered to be the flag of the Japanese Navy. All right, and on the right, look very closely, you see that this is the American flag that has only 48 stars. Kind of fun to watch the World War II movies and see if they make that mistake. Yes, Alaska and Hawaii are not on that flag quite yet. Let's begin. So it is May 1942. All right. The Jimmy Doolittle raid has already happened, and it has been about, I'm going to say, January, February, March, April, May, almost 6 months since the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. Let's go to the map. Now, if you look at this map very carefully, to use the German word, the Japanese blitzkrieg has really done remarkably well. They have taken parts of Manchuria, which has been contested for years. In 1937, they sealed a deal. They now have a lot of slave labor, a lot of the key cities in China, the rice fields. They have taken over French Indochina, Vietnam, Thailand, and those areas, because remember, France succumbed to the Blitzkrieg in May of 1940. And so with France gone, Japan was able to occupy that. You know, a lot of guys that study World War II forget that it just wasn't Pearl Harbor. That was a big week for the Japanese. On December 7th and December 8th, there was Pearl Harbor, the Hawaiian Territories. There was Wake Island. There was Guam. Later, we're going to see a very well-coordinated and lucky attack in the Philippines against Douglas MacArthur, the Bataan Death March, the attack on the British fleet at Singapore. Oh, it's a mess. But if you look right down here, guys, we have this little large island and this archipelago here, all right, the Solomons, and here we have a place called New Guinea. It has a very tall mountain range called the Owen Stanley Mountain Range, and if you notice, the northern half of the tropical island, with the triple canopies and the tremendous temperatures, belongs to the Japanese. They have a very extensive air base right here at a place called Leh. And quite frankly, if you look across the Owen Stanley Mountains, here is Port Moresby. That is our locale. And Port Moresby basically is in charge of defending Australia and defending the islands of the Solomons. If you look over here, here's Guadalcanal. We'll talk about that in a future episode. That'll be the first time we ever meet the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat, and quite frankly, that battle lasted way too long. If we have to try to clean up every one of these islands of Japanese garrisons, we might be in the Pacific men until 47, 48. We're going to have to go into something called island hopping. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, if you notice here, we have a bomb here. Yes, the Japanese military was able to bomb northern Australia and even was able to bomb, I believe, places like Darwin. But they wanted to seal the deal. And to do that, they're going to have to invade. And the best way to invade Australia is to capture all of New Guinea. Now, this is about, I'm going to say, okay, now we said it was between May 4th and May 8th, right? And the Coral Sea is about, I'd say 500 miles to the northeast of Australia. But man, there's going to be so much action in these waters here that literally you could spend over an hour talking about it. You know, not far from Florida Island here, right about this area, right about here, is where John F. Kennedy, the young JG lieutenant, got his patrol boat, torpedo boat, cut in half by a Japanese destroyer one fateful evening, PT-109. All right? So, the Japanese are going to try to use their very excellent carrier fleet to take Australia and to take New Guinea, the rest of New Guinea. But why wouldn't they? Men, as we talked about in class, the Japanese are very, very much ahead of schedule. They have had tremendous victories, and quite frankly, when they're doing their war games and their calculations, they expected to have a tremendous loss of manpower, sea power, and more important, aviation. But it didn't turn out that way. It turned out that they were ahead of schedule. Their losses were really, I'm going to use the word insignificant. The number of serious vessels they lost was practically nil. To lose 100 vessels in the first 6 months of the Pacific War is nothing. And a lot of this has to do with the Japanese Navy, a very proud, well-disciplined Navy, and the discipline among the sailors and the officers is some of the toughest you're ever going to see in the history of World War II. Remember, men, the Japanese drill and they drill and they drill, and it's not a question of they want to do it so they can get it right. They want to be able to do it so they can never get it wrong. So America is going to be up against a very formidable, a very, very excellent fighting force in the Imperial Japanese Navy. All right. Now, what they don't know, the poor Japanese, is that we have broken the purple codes, the INJ 25. Yes, this is the way that the Japanese Navy used to encrypt their messages and send it over, radio and shortwave, and in such a way where we could not decipher it. Well, we worked on it for a very, very long time, and the guys back at Pearl Harbor were able to break a good chunk of the code. And that's going to allow them to understand what's going on here. You see, men, you can't take New Guinea unless you have air supremacy. That's the lesson of World War II. Whether it's Normandy, whether it's Wake Island, whether it's Guadalcanal, I don't care where you are. Air supremacy is a must for seaborne invasions. Every Marine can tell you that. Well, since we were reading their mail, and we're now going to bring down our carrier force to intercept them, several days before the early part of May, we're going to play cat and mouse with them. There's going to be PBY, flying boats. The Japanese have a tremendous fleet of seaplanes, submarines, and we're going to be playing tag looking for each other. But we have a better idea where the Japanese are. And so in this picture right here, when on May 7th, the Naval Task Force sank the Japanese carrier Suiho, this was a big, big loss for the Japanese. Now, it's interesting. You can always look at the Japanese carriers and look at this. Their exhaust panels are always on the side. Their smokestacks are always on the side. And usually they don't have very much of an island up here, as we'll see with our ships. And the idea of having the smokestack on the side is to give the aviators all the visibility in landing and taking off. All right. This is the USS Saratoga and USS Yorktown, right? These are classic old school American aircraft carriers that were named after continental battles, the American Revolutionary War. And contrary to popular belief, men, they do have wooden decks. Yes, a lot of carriers had wooden decks to save weight. And remember, men, these carriers are photographed by themselves, but they don't travel by themselves. There's destroyers and light cruisers and heavy cruisers whose job is to escort and to make sure that these floating cities don't get attacked by the enemy. The Japanese have that long Lance 24 torpedo, which is one of the most effective torpedoes in the world at that time. The American torpedoes' success rate wasn't quite as good. In fact, we had a lot of problems with our torpedoes in the first 6 months of the war. They didn't detonate, they ran too deep, they porpoised and jumped out of the water. Oh, there was a lot of problems. So, men, please remember, when you see a carrier task force, the carriers are always with other ships. Pardon me. Kind of like an escort service. The Saratoga and the famous Yorktown. All right. Now, gentlemen, on May 4th, right? May 5th, the battle continues. And, men, actually, it's the only time in history that the attacking ships did not see each other. This was practically a complete aviation battle. It's the first time it's ever happened. And quite frankly, I think this era of carrier-to-carrier combat is now behind us. But if you look on the left, right, there is the United States Navy and the Marines use this. This is called a Dauntless. Got the dive brakes, the pilot and the gunner. You can see the 500-pound bomb. It's attached to a little bit of an arm that swings out away from the bomber. And this is known as a vertical dive bomber. Why is that important? Well, horizontal bombers like this, like B-17s and B-24s, right, drop on this plane. But Dauntlesses and dive bombers, right, they come down practically vertical. And because of that dive brake, they're going to be able to pull out and take the G's and survive with a more accurate, shall we say, delivery system. Big difference between vertical bombers and horizontal bombers. Okay. Now, men, I want to tell you a story, okay? The Yorktown is going to get beat up pretty good, but it's later going to be repaired in record time. But the Lexington is going to take a lot of hits, the Lady Lex. And she's going to have to be scuttled. And men, a lot of times accidents happen in war, the fog of war, the confusion. And apparently the story is that there was a lot of aviation fuel and a lot of ammunition and ordnance and bombs and things of that nature, right? And there were vapors. There were vapors and generators. And because of that, that explosion became almost like spontaneous combustion. And once it hit the ammo lockers, the Lexington was in deep trouble. Later, the crew is going to have to scuttle this proud ship. So, men, quite frankly, so far the Battle of the Coral Sea is a draw. It's been a draw. All right. But now, the Shukaku, which is a great aircraft carrier, you can see that in this particular model, it does have the island over here. But look at, the smoke ducts are off to the aft here a little bit. You can see the 16-petal chrysanthemum of the Emperor. And men, this is one of their Class A carriers, right? When the Shukaku was damaged and forced out of battle, this can have long-term effects. That carrier was going to be assigned to protect the Japanese Marines that were going to attack Port Moresby. Yeah, wait a minute, let's go back. Yeah, Port Moresby. Wait a minute, that's us, yeah. And so the Japanese are going to try to invade Port Moresby without accurate air cover, and they're going to be pushed back. Men, New Guinea is going to be saved, and because New Guinea is going to be saved, Australia is going to be saved. Men, all the Australians talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea as the battle that saved Australia. Unfortunately, in the United States, unless you're a World War II buff, most people never heard of the Battle of the Coral Sea. But in Australia, that was their deliverance day. All right, story. Stick to the story, old man. All right. Sorry, sometimes I get excited. Okay. Now, men, I put this in here because this happens all the time. A Japanese task force of Zeros and Vals, those are dive bombers, got confused after one of the summer storms. And it tried to land on one of the American carriers. And before they got into their final approach, they were knocked out of the sky. This type of confusion and friendly fire and mistakes happen in every battle. Men in World War II, friendly fire, I think I read one statistic, could be as high as between 15 and 25% of all casualties and wounds are caused by errant bombs or by confusion about who the enemy is. The fog of war. It's a real thing. All right. So, gentlemen, Here are the Japanese naval aviators with their katanas. Many of those katanas were the ancient samurai swords that are 2 and 3 and even 400 years old. They go back to the golden age of the warrior, the samurai, to serve. And the Japanese Navy had such a proud tradition that a lot of these pilots were allowed to take their katanas with them, especially later in the war during the kamikaze missions. Now, the katana, men, was a piece of art, and some people have argued that the katana may be the sharpest and the best made sword of history. So if you're like a military artist, or you're into artifacts like this, right? Yeah, I know they're the Japanese, but these swords were considered to be masterpieces of art. And when they went down with the airplane, they were lost forever. The katana, the samurai sword, Bushido, the coat of the warrior. Gentlemen, this is a good number for us, because the Japanese Zero, which we talked about in class, that incredible maneuverable aircraft, was killing us at a ratio of about 6 to 1. Some reports I've read said it was high as 8 to 1. If you're losing 8 Navy or Army fighters for every Japanese airplane, that's not a good statistic. It all depends on the source that you read, but one thing is for sure. In the first 6 months, these warriors who fought in China and Korea, right, they had the advantage over us. They were skilled aviators, and they were deadly aces. Remember, to be an ace, you have to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft. And trust me, that's a lot difficulter. What kind of English is that? That's a lot more difficult than it sounds. All right. Okay. So what did it all mean? After we saved Guinea, we saved Port Moresby. Well, men, what it meant was that we had finally got a good feeling about ourselves. Okay, Jimmy Doolittle and the B-25 Raiders off the Hornet, USS Hornet, right? That was a psychological blow. But we had met the enemy in the open ocean, and we did all right. We prevented a major invasion. Not only is it going to affect the rest of the war in the Pacific, right? It gave the Americans a little bit of pride. And it also tarnished the Japanese reputation, because the Japanese truly believed that they could just wipe up with not much trouble, the decadent British, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders. And this battle gave us something to be proud of. We met them, we fought, and we defeated them. Or at least, at the very minimum, we prevented them from getting their goal, which was New Guinea and Australia. All right? Now, lads, here's the thing that I found interesting in some of the readings I've done. There were mechanics and technicians, especially aviation mechanics, because remember, aviation's only been around since what? The Wright brothers was at 1903? I've forgotten. December 17th, 1903. I'm going to have to look that up. So, you got a lot of guys that were really, really well trained. And when you lose mechanics and engineers, or guys that are really good with, tools and how to repair engines and how to take care of aircraft, you just can't replace those guys. And the pilots, the Japanese lost a lot of great guys from the graduating classes, right? And those pilots cannot be replaced. Experience cannot be replaced. Those technicians and pilots are going to be very, very much missed, especially right around 1943, the end of 43 and 44 and 45, when the Japanese are sending basically green pilots that are not properly trained to fight against American aircraft. And then by 1945, we had learned how to win in the sky with incredible fighting machines like the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F-6F Hellcat, a plane designed for the Navy specifically to kill the Mitsubishi Zero. All right, a couple review questions. Which nation did the Japanese hope to cut off by taking control of the Coral Sea region, including Port Moresby? New Guinea. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first wartime engagement where blank fought each other in head-to-head manner. Aircraft carriers, They never saw each other. It was a pure aviation battle. What enabled the United States to determine the Japanese plan to attack the Coral Sea region, including strategic Port Moresby? INJ-25, the purple codes. And what American aircraft carrier, had to be scuttled by our own crew? And we lost a lot of people that day. The USS Lexington. Yes. All right. And we talked about the Japanese Zero. What an amazing machine. Remember one thing you may have forgotten. The Japanese sacrificed armor for the cockpit and self-sealing gas tanks for maneuverability and speed. So men, this plane was a dancer. But if you were able to get on its tail, or lucky enough to get the shot, the fuel tanks would blow apart like a torch. But the Japanese figured, well, you know what? You can't shoot what you can't catch. We go with armor, and we go with heavy firepower, and the Japanese go with lighter aircraft, maneuverability, and pilot skill. And in the end, not only will numerical superiority win, we will learn about the Japanese Zero when we find one intact, abandoned in a field, upside down in the marshes, in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands. Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to Midway. So, there it is, the Battle of the Coral Sea. And finally, the United States has something to be proud of. And the Japanese now realize something, that this may not be as easy as they thought. Men, in our next episode, we're going to go to the Battle of Midway Island. Remember what Admiral Yamamoto said, and I paraphrased, speaking to the Emperor, talking about planning for Pearl Harbor. I will run rampant as the Emperor soared to the Pacific for 6 months. If we have not come to a successful conclusion at the end of those 6 months, and I fear Japan will have only awakened a sleeping giant and filled that giant with horrible, terrible resolve. And he was right. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, almost to the day, the Battle of Midway, where 6 minutes is going to change history. And from that moment on, the Japanese will no longer be on the offensive. The Japanese will be on the defensive, and America will turn the tide. All right, guys, I hope you stick around next time. The Battle of Midway Island. If I ever hit the lottery, I'm going out there, guys. I really am. I'm going to go to Wake Island. I'm going to Midway. I'm going to go to New Guinea. I'm going to try to find myself an old Japanese Zero laying out there in the fields. And if I'm really, really lucky, maybe even find myself a wildcat. All right, guys. Hope you have a wonderful time. Remember, I'm always available for private tutoring. Any questions at all, anything you want to add, all right, any corrections, you let me know. Mr. O'Brien signing off. And you know what? I can't wait to see you again. All right, take care.